Okay, so in this final section, what we're going to be looking through is how to effectively build out a training program based on everything that we've covered so far. So taking into consideration what hockey demands of the body, what assessments we can do to understand what an athlete's capable of, the strength training that we can do to prepare the athlete physically for those demands, the conditioning program, speed and plyometric elements, how we can put together movement prep. So all of this then kind of feeds into this final section. And the first video here is looking at the training year. So this is a very high level view of the different training phases and ultimately how we can go about separating out the calendar to make life simple, to hopefully remove a bit of ambiguity of where do you start when actually pulling a program together. Periodization as a whole can come across as being particularly complex and often I think needlessly so. I think it's just effective planning in the long run, really. So we're going to be talking through a few different ways in which we can periodize, a couple of different systems that I've used previously, and then the next video we're looking at the kind of training month, the individual training block, and then lastly there'll be one on the training week and the kind of the detail of how you can actually piece all of these different elements together. So if we just look at the learning outcomes first of all, the first one is to understand the basic principles of planning and periodization. We're going to evaluate current understanding, hopefully develop some skills in this area, and then create a short training cycle based on your context. That's important. It needs to be based on what you're currently working on that meets the needs of the hockey player whilst providing effective use of loading and unloading strategies. So by the end of this section, hopefully we'll have a clearer understanding of what periodization is, how you can begin to build out the training calendar, what the priorities are at different training phases, and then within the actual training week itself, how can we combine all these different training elements and requirements to build out key priorities and a clear, concise training plan. So what we're going to try and do is go from this kind of Google Earth to Street View idea, so going from a high level of the training year to then an individual unit, and then lastly on the ground, what it actually looks like. So going from the satellite down to London, down to Big Ben, the big picture down to the specific details of what it actually looks like week to week, take into consideration everything we've looked at so far. Periodization, really simply, is effective planning. It can become a little complicated at times, and there are many different kind of ways in which you can go about periodizing training, but effectively it's just planning out training units to manage load, manage stress, and being able to perform during key moments so that you're at your best, fittest and freshest during the most important times, and you're more fatigued and slightly less prepared during times when it doesn't matter that that's the case. So maybe that's during the off season when you can work a bit harder, or during pre-season when you're going to be putting quite a lot of work but you're not necessarily feeling that fresh on a Saturday. In comparison to the middle of the season where we actually want to be performing on the weekend, and adding excess training stress is not necessarily a good idea because it's going to hinder our ability to perform. So it's just understanding what the priority is in a given training phase so that we can put together a program that meets the needs of the athlete at that time. So in terms of definitions, we've got a macrocycle, which is the whole training year, and that's his first video. A mesocycle, which is the training month. So these phases do differ, and sometimes a macrocycle can be 2 years, but for simplicity's sake, macrocycle is a year, a mesocycle is a month, and a microcycle is a week. So if you hear these terms interchangeably, this is what we ultimately mean. The overall training calendar of the year, an individual training month, and then lastly the training week. So very typically there are going to be 4 to 5 microcycles per mesocycle, and there are going to be 12 mesocycles in one macrocycle. So this first video is going to look at that macrocycle, the whole training year, and then there'll be 2 more subsequent videos looking more and more detail of how we actually can use some basic principles to plan out these individual training units. So where to start? This is the hard bit initially, because sometimes you look at a blank piece of paper and there are sort of biased approaches, in my opinion, towards, if you type in periodization sort of planner into Google, you'll find all sorts of complicated Excel sheets with coloured boxes. And from my perspective, it is more of a constraint than a help. And there needs to be a simple way of we can just build a system that works for our context. And then sometimes I feel like having those training blocks means that you're more stressed about filling the blocks in than you are actually about developing a program that is actually effective for you. The main thing to start off is what are your key dates and competitions, which then creates natural training phases, windows of training opportunity, and opportunities to push and opportunities to recover. That's kind of the first and most important thing to do, really. So when we look at the entire training year, the first thing you've got to do is put in where are your key dates, so for example, competitions, selections, camps, key matches, put it all down, because these are the things we're ultimately trying to prepare for, is actually competition, preparing to win. So once we've done that, then we're going to have some natural windows, if you like. So for example, let's say we're looking at the club season in England. This is the Women's Premier Division. We're going to have all of the different dates for different competitions, different if we're taking this one, it's the Premier Division, so all club fixtures throughout the in-season, and we can write all of those out onto a piece of paper, onto Excel, whatever works for you, and then you can pretty simply highlight the key ones, and then you're going to start to build out natural training phases. Then obviously you're going to have a period where you're not competing, and that's your off-season, and then you've got a period leading into the season, which is your pre-season. So it's nice and simple once we lay it out in that way. So these are our kind of three key phases ultimately. We have our in-season, which is when we're trying to perform week in, week out. So we're trying to obviously offset the amount of fatigue during the week. Off-season, this is kind of the prevent sort of section. In other words, we're trying to prevent ourselves from detraining too much. We're also trying to prevent things like overuse injuries by doing much more generalized training. And just kind of things like cross-training, so we're doing other sports or we're taking some time out, and that prevents things from like things such as overtraining, potential injury, overuse injury, that kind of thing. And then we've got the pre-season where we start to prepare. So we've got perform, prevent and prepare, and the pre-season sort of period, we'll say typically is around sort of 6 weeks. That's when we're preparing for the season. So this gives us our natural three blocks. We've got in-season, off-season, pre-season. And each of the three have got different priorities in that kind of period. So we can approach the programming in slightly different ways during different phases based on the requirements of those blocks. So this is the first thing to do, is to, once you've listed out all the key different events, we then have our natural three blocks, and we can put them into different colours or however works for you. But the most important thing is to identify when these are. Anthony Turner did a great paper just looking at kind of a summary, really, if you like, of what periodization is. And he included general preparation, specific preparation, and competition. So we can flip these into the off-season for general, the pre-season for specific, and then in-season for competition. And as you can see, we've got volume, intensity, and technical work, or technique development. And as you can see, during the general preparation period, the off-season, the volume's going to be high and the intensity is going to be low. And this makes sense because it's a period where we want to do lots of generalised training, non-hockey specific, maybe doing different sports. But the intensity isn't going to be particularly high because we're a long way from being ready to start the season again. And we also need a period of recovery post-season. The pre-season then begins to reduce in terms of overall volume, but the intensity is going to start to pick up. Now, there may also be concurrent increases in volume too if we haven't done any hockey. So hockey-specific volume might increase. But in terms of the whole training week, it's probably going to look a little bit lower in volume-wise. But the technical work is going to ramp up because we're obviously going to try and get ready for the season again. And then during the season, the technique work is going to be, the most important thing week in, week out. We're going to be trying to solve some of the problems on the pitch that you've had in matches, that kind of thing. The volume of physical training, again, is going to be lower because the volume of hockey training is going to be that much higher. And the intensity is going to be at the highest point because it's going to be lots of week in, week out matches. And so again, we've got these three distinct phases, which gives us three distinct blocks, three distinct priorities, and three different approaches that are required in the training year. So in the season, the priority is to perform. So on the weekend, we're trying to perform by having a reduction in training volume from physical training. We want to complement the high volumes of hockey training competition. We want to keep players available. So there's probably going to be a slightly bigger emphasis placed on mobility, on tissue capacity work, on reductions in loading in the gym, for example, because we don't want to add needless training stress onto a player who's already carrying fatigue in during the season, when the priority is to perform, not to prepare. So this is where S&C, for example, has to ease off a little bit because the volume of hockey has picked up. Then during the off season, this is a prevent kind of a sort of priority, if you like. And by prevent, we mean taking a period of recovery first and foremost, because post-season there needs to be a chance to have that recovery period. Otherwise, in the long term, you're going to start getting things like accumulation of long-term chronic fatigue. Going to review and reflect on season outcomes to prevent problems from happening again in the upcoming season. And then you've got a very general training focus. We're going to try and plug gaps now. So there's more of a injury prevention focus potentially. We're going to do generalized training. We're not going to worry about making things hockey specific, because if we're always doing something specific, A, we can't really overload the body particularly effectively, and B, you start to get things like overuse injury. And then during pre-season, we start to pick back up again. So we've got a period to prepare for the season. There's a window of opportunity for physical training, and there's going to be an increase in training volume as we begin to prepare for in-season demands. So hockey volume begins to increase. The physical training is probably going to increase in intensity. The overall volume of what we're trying to add on top of hockey is going to start to ease back a little bit more now. And we're going to try and get ourselves in the best position possible for the season. So as an overview, then, we can look at something a little bit like this. Imagining this is just the UK club season, starting in September, finishing in April. And you can see how these distinct phases now become clear. We have a sort of 4-month cycle up until Christmas. We then have the January indoor season. We've got a few months post-Christmas then with league and cup matches. We've then got an off-season period in May, June. We've then got pre-season in July and August. Now, it's often not quite as clean-cut as this, and dates will vary, but this is just to give you a high-level overview of the kind of simplicity of this. So then we just put in some couple of key dates here. We've got indoor season here. This is also like the off-season from the club. Got your blue pre-season, another off-season window, and we've also got some key matches towards the end in April of cup stuff. We've also got some key matches in November, and I've just put here there's a bye week, for example, in October. So what this does is it gives us probably 4 or 5 phases. We've got our initial in-season block, a mini off-season, another in-season block, another off-season, another pre-season block. And so our approach can differ based on that. So starting from September, the priority here is to perform. So our S&C volumes are probably going to ease back a little bit. We're not too worried about trying to really push people on physically. We're just trying to keep people fresh, particularly for these key matches here. And the bye week in week 3 is an opportunity for a little period of recovery, say 6 weeks in there. In January, you've got an opportunity for some, relative unloading, a little bit of deload there potentially. And then leading back into post-Christmas, we've got another little training block. So that gives us a nice sort of starting point, really, in terms of the different phases. But there was a really great paper from John Kiley, which was effectively stated that our previous views of periodization were founded on the premise that responses are substantially predictable. In other words, if we simply design a training program, then we're going to take a person from point A to point B in a predictable, logical manner. But we know this isn't true. Everyone's going to respond differently. And as he says in this paper, individual variation typically oscillates widely about group-based means, thereby suggesting a growing disconnect between periodization ideologies that assume predictability and stability of timeframes and progression schemes, and the evidenced reality of biological complexity, which very nicely summarizes the idea that people are not predictable, people individually respond in different ways, and there are other things to consider than just the training program. So I just wanted to touch on that as well, because I think that's also key, is the plan needs to be based on biological reality, and there needs to be something inbuilt to enable a little bit of flexibility in how that is achieved. Now, one of those things could be, for example, in the strength training section, I spoke through things like reps in reserve as a useful means of establishing an ability to auto-regulate training intensity. So if you're feeling good on a certain day, we can raise things up a little bit, and if we're feeling fatigued, we can ease off a little bit. And that's one nice way we can do that. So potentially giving ranges or using those heuristics on a weekly basis is an effective means of accounting for the evidenced reality of biological complexity, as John Carley put it. Now, one way we can do that is with systems, which I'll talk about in just a second. But these are the sort of factors that we can sort of consider really when we're thinking about biological reality. There's not just training stresses that we have to account for, and people therefore don't adapt in linear manners. If they're a younger athlete and they're still in education, maybe there's academic stress. There is a lack of sleep to consider, particularly the case if they are, athletes who've got children. Nutrition, selection coming up adds pressure. Individual personality types are going to differ. Some people tolerate stress more than others. Finances, maybe there's, some sort of financial difficulties that people are experiencing that add stress. Mentioned about children, that's obviously a key one. Travel and relationships as well. And relationships is not just, partners and that kind of thing, but just with family, friends. Maybe someone's going through a sort of turbulent time. All of these factors have to be considered in creating a system that kind of accounts for these things. And that's why having something like inbuilt heuristics, flexibility, ranges within training sessions just means that we can adapt things as required. So an alternative approach to this is to use a systems-based approach. And I mentioned this previously within the conditioning section, which is to use a kind of decision-making process to determine whether someone should be doing one program versus the other. So it's not cookie cutter, and it accounts for the fact that everyone's going to be in different positions at different times. As John Carley says, periodization isn't linear, and it's essentially a little bit naive to think that you can take a group of athletes all from point A to point B and have them all peak at the same time. They're all going to be in different positions in order to get there. So you can use one approach like this. I've mentioned it already. Has a benchmark been met? Yes or no? That makes a decision for you. Until that's been met, you focus on something else. Whilst you're focusing on that, you have inbuilt systems to enable you to modify training sessions based on fatigue. So it could be that you do, a mass conditioning session, and you do, 3 sets of 12 to 15 repetitions. If you're feeling fatigued, do 12. Feeling good, do 15. Because every day, athletes are coming into it in a different state. So you have to have that inbuilt flexibility. And then has the RSA standard been achieved, yes or no? And then you can also make decisions based on that. Here's a way I put this together when I was working at Hockey Wales. So this is, on the left-hand side, a strength training decision tree. On the right-hand side, a conditioning decision tree. So with the strength training kind of decision tree, it started off with tissue conditioning scores, and you'll notice this follows the hierarchy of need that I mentioned. So you've either got red, orange, or green, and we had traffic light systems for this. You can decide what those look like, but as an example, a calf raised traffic light would be green would be 30, orange 25, red 20. So if an athlete's on a red score, then clearly for tissue conditioning, that's a big priority for them. So within their strength training session, more volume needs to be thrown at the tissue conditioning than the max strength exercises, for example. And then you focus more on the strength training. So how many reps can you complete at 1.5 times body weight? None, 1 to 2, or 3. That also means that you've hit a sort of strength standard there as well. In terms of conditioning, it was actually based on a 10 pitch lengths at the time, but same principles, amber, red, green. Once you've hit green, then you focus on the RSA profile, and that gives you an individualized approach to your conditioning as well. So everyone knows at all times, I'm a level 2 strength and a level 3 conditioning, and so you'd follow a slightly separate program to someone else at a given time, and all the sessions have got that inbuilt flexibility, such as volume, so that if you're fresh, you can push on, and if you're fatigued, you can ease back. And that just accounts for that biological reality, which is that everyone requires individualization. Sometimes it's hard to provide a truly individual program week in, week out if you're working with high numbers. And so sometimes a system like this just enables that to be done nice and simply. So that's the overview of the training year so far. So I hope that's been useful in terms of giving you a high-level overview of how we determine what those phases look like, and a brief summary of a couple of ways we can go about approaching planning for sort of effective training outcomes.